I'm Liz Ripley. I'm the Conservation and Cover Crop Outreach Specialist with Iowa Learning Farms, and we have a great program ahead for you. But for those of you that are unfamiliar with Iowa Learning Farms, we are based on campus at Iowa State University, and we were established in 2004, and our goal is to build a culture of conservation. And we do so by working with farmers, landowners, researchers, and our agency partners as well to help improve water quality and soil health while helping our farmers and landowners remain profitable. We're able to do these types of events thanks to our great partners, so I want to just give them a shout out. They include the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the USDA NRCS, or the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, US EPA Section 319, our conservation districts of Iowa, the Iowa Farm Bureau, Practical Farmers of Iowa, Growmark Inc., Iowa Agriculture Water Alliance, Iowa Corn, and the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. And today's particular topic is actually also sponsored by North Central SARE, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Grant, where we're going to be learning more about perennial vegetation here. So just a few housekeeping things. I do ask that you keep your cameras off and remain muted while I'm playing the videos. But then once we open it up for discussion, you're welcome to unmute to ask your questions or submit them at any time in the chat box, and I'll get those directed to our presenters today, which happen to be Dr. Mark Licht, Iowa State University Extension Cropping Specialist, Systems Specialist, and Dr. Adam Janke, the Iowa State University Extension Wildlife Specialist. So following today's presentation, you'll be getting a brief email with a survey link that we ask that you fill out and give us some feedback on these virtual events. And there'll also be a link to today's recorded virtual field day. So if you want to go back and check something out, or if you know someone who wasn't able to join us, you can share them that link as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Mark and Adam to set the stage a little bit, and then we'll get to our video.
Hey, Adam, I'm going to let you go because I just had some technical difficulties with my camera.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. Excited to have you on the virtual field day today. We're talking about this project, as Liz just indicated, that was supported by a SARE grant that was titled Redefining the Field Edge. Basically, what we were trying to do in this grant was kind of take a multidisciplinary approach to looking at the advantages of identifying profit loss areas and crop fields and reimagining what alternative uses we could have for those areas, specifically by integrating diverse perennial native vegetation like prairie into those areas in the field. And so Mark, of course, is an agronomist, and I, of course, am a wildlife ecologist, and we're going to both kind of talk about what we've been learning from this study. And to do so, we're going to take you back to August, when Mark and I had a really pleasant conversation at a place where we're trying to do this on a really small scale demonstration area on the ISU Field Extension Education Laboratory, east of Boone and west of Ames, just west of campus here. So we're going to take you back to that warm August day here on the video, where we're going to have a conversation about this practice. We're going to talk first about just the basic premise of the approach and what we did at FEEL and what we're finding other farmers and landowners are successfully doing across the state. Then we're going to take a pause and talk a little bit about what we talked about in the video here in a live dialogue, and then go back and play a second part of the video where we talk about some of the management challenges and opportunities, and also some of the programs that are available to help you or people that you work with implement this on their land across the state. We'll have another discussion and wrap it up and head on with our cold February day instead of this nice August day we're getting ready to escape to. So anything else for you to say, Mark?
No, thank you.
Okay, glad to have you back on video. I think with that, then, Liz, we could go ahead and play this first video for the group.
Hello, I'm Mark Licht. I'm an Extension Cropping Systems Specialist with the Department of Agronomy at Iowa State University.
Hi, I'm Adam Janke. I'm the Wildlife Extension Specialist in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management at Iowa State. And we're out here at the Field Extension Education Laboratory. And Mark, what does that mean? What do we use this facility for?
Yeah, so this facility is really an extension teaching facility. So we bring in a lot of farmers and a lot of agronomists to talk about different things within crop production. And so today we're actually standing in a perennial seeding. It's actually a CP23 mix that we're standing in that was established in the spring of 2020. We chose this area largely because this part of the farm typically has water ponding in it, especially in the spring of the year when the creek bank over there comes out of its banks and comes up here and ponds for several weeks at a time. And so this area we generally did not get good crop growth and productivity out of, and so it was a prime candidate to put into perennial grasses.
So that's what brings me here. I'm a wildlife ecologist and normally do my education on the margins of our crop fields. And instead, we're here in what used to be a demonstration plot that kind of consistently caused problems or challenges at the farm in the production goals and wasn't actually achieving the educational goal set out for demonstrating soybean production practices or varieties and things like that. And instead, we rethought what we wanted to do with this piece of the farm in a way that we find farmers across Iowa are starting to rethink about where the field margins should be and what some alternatives could be in areas that are consistently not producing or not profitable, in an opportunity to integrate wildlife habitat, diverse native perennial vegetation back into our landscape that provides water quality benefits, soil health benefits, wildlife and biodiversity benefits, beautiful aesthetics, and it takes an area that we used to be losing money and makes it at least cost neutral, and in some cases maybe a little bit profitable if we can enroll it in something like this conservation reserve program.
So when we look at this area, it looks really good now, a year and a half later. But what we did to establish this area is it was soybeans the prior year to establishment. We came in the spring of the year, and we broadcast seeded at a frost seeding time frame, and then we let it get up and going, and we mowed it off 3 times through that growing season. And then earlier this year, in the June time frame, we mowed it off once, for that. And so that was the practice that we used to get this established, and we have pretty good establishment out here, I think.
So one important consideration that we need to remember when we're growing native perennial plants on our farm is that the management of those plants is going to be different than what we're used to in our typical crop production practices. And that's because in our typical crop production practices, we're growing annual plants. And in native planting like this, we're growing perennial plants that'll be here for a long time. And the biggest distinction with a perennial plant is that in the first year or year and a half, those perennial plants are growing down instead of putting biomass above ground like we're used to seeing with our crops or our annual plants. And so that's why we need to take care in the first year or 2 years to really try to create conditions that are favorable for the establishment of those root systems that'll feed that perennial plant for years to come, and to help it outcompete all the annual plants that are going to be found on the site as well. We've actually found that the people out here at Field have done a really nice job in stewarding this planting to ensure that the perennial plants were favored over the annuals. And here, 2 years almost after the first seeding, we find that that's paid off with the growth of some really nice native grasses and native wildflowers that are going to take off from here and start to dominate even more now that they have these well-established root systems.
So that establishment's really quite key, Adam. So we look at even this, and yes, there's a lot of the desirable species out here that we want to see. There's the native grasses, there's some of the forbs out here, but you still see some of the annual grasses, the annual weeds out here. And we're 2 years into it,
yeah,
but it's something that we should expect. And quite honestly, a lot of people get really frustrated in that first year because they hardly see any of the natives and they see mostly the annual weedy species.
Yes, so a perennial planting like this takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes persistence. And what we want to talk about today is some of the practices that you could employ on your farm if you're thinking about finding these low profit areas to put into perennial vegetation to ensure the most likely successful outcome on your farm. Okay, so in the introduction to the video, you told us about some of the steps that you and the folks at Field took to get us here. So let's walk us through. One thing you said was CP23 mix. What does that mean, and why is it that you chose that for this site?
Yeah, so a CP23 mix it's a conservation program mixture, and it's designed for these lower, wetter areas that tend to be saturated for a good portion of the time. A CP23 mix is more heavily on the grasses and less heavy on the forbs, and so it's one of those that, yes, you're going to get some pollinator, you're going to get some migratory species that are going to come through it, but we're really targeting, the grasses here more so than other species.
I love it when an agronomist talks about pollinators and migratory species. So I agree. And yes, so the nice thing about CP23 is it's a widespread conservation reserve program practice. And so it's basically a seed mix that you can buy off the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
You could go it alone. There's lots of resources from, for example, the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa that could help you devise your own seed mix. But for the most part, a turnkey operation of a nice mix of native perennial plants that are adapted to wet spots is going to be something that's going to work in floodplains and prairie potholes and other places that we find where crops consistently fail across the state.
Mm-hmm.
So we picked our seed mix. We did our first year control in that we're thinking about any potential residual herbicide effects, particularly probably following corn as the most consequential. We have good weed control. And then now we need to plant it. What we say about planting native perennial vegetation is that we often want to do it the way Mother Nature would do it. And the way Mother Nature does it is she spreads the seed on the surface of the ground over winter after all these plants have matured, developed that seed, and then just dropped it. So this isn't something that we need to bury deep into the ground like sometimes we're tempted to do in our gardens or in our fields. We want to put this, just scratch it into the surface if you use a no-till drill, or you could even do a broadcast seeding like what we did in this patch here.
So keep in mind that a lot of these species, the seeds are very small. And so like any small seeded species, the depth is really key. And so right on the soil surface with some rain is enough soil to seed contact to actually get good germination and emergence. You think of corn, soybeans, or even some of the small grains, they're much larger seeds, and so putting them, a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch to 2 inches deep works best. But with these species, if you get it too deep, you're going to actually really hurt your establishment.
Yep.
So Adam, after we get it established and we get going, how do we manage it from there? Kind of nurture that establishment a little bit further.
So it's going to be different every year that the plot is out there. This is a long-term investment. It isn't necessarily something that we plant and we leave it. And that's especially true in the first 2 years. And that's where, as we mentioned, out here, there was consistent mowing. And we want to try to, whenever we have an opportunity, scout our fields and understand the competition between the native perennial plants that are growing down in that first year. We want to try to find those and understand how they're relating to all the annual plants, the weeds essentially, that are trying to grow up and take advantage of all the sunlight. And we can advantage those native perennial plants in the first year by relatively consistent mowing, something like 3 mowings throughout the growing season at 6 to 8 inches. It doesn't need to look like a golf course. It shouldn't look like a golf course, but something that sort of sets back those annuals and gives those perennials that are just right at the surface of the ground a chance to gather some sunlight and invest in those roots in that first year. The second year of the planting, we start to think about our transition out of the mowing phase, and we can base it off of scouting. We can look at whether or not the perennials have established in the plot and how the annuals are doing as well. And we may be able to let it go, or as we mentioned in this plot, we did mow it once earlier this year to allow for some of these warm season species to come on later in the year and start to outcompete the annuals. And then from there, your plot should theoretically be established. We want to keep scouting it and looking for problematic species like invasive species like Canada thistle or other problematic species that might threaten the stand. And then we also want to anticipate sort of a long-term management strategy. And the best long-term management strategy, if we can do it, is prescribed fire.
Sure.
To occasionally burn off some of the plant residual, favor the growth of many of these wildflowers and wild grass, native grasses that are adapted to fire, and also to outcompete the encroachment of woody vegetation that even in this 1.5-year-old plot, we already see some woody vegetation establishing, and we'll want to try to find a way to manage that. And fire is a really good way to do that too.
And for that intermediate to long-term management, yes, the fires are great, but things like the Canada thistle or some of the other weedy species, you may end up going in and just spot spraying an individual area, or timing a mowing, just for an isolated area a little bit there too. So it's kind of a mix and match depending on what you're seeing as you're walking out through those areas.
Yep.
All right.
So Liz, maybe before that first question, as I was listening here this morning, I know I was a little bit vague on what that CP23 mix is. And so some of the people on the line here probably know a little bit more about it than even I do, but there are different CP23 mixes. There's a mesic, there's a flood prone, and there's a hydric. And so you can kind of mix and match those to the, I'll call it the soil moisture levels that area might have.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and if you have questions, feel free to get them in the chat or just let me know and we can get you unmuted and ask them. One question that did come in, we actually heard this yesterday from one of our landowners, is that it can be really intimidating to use fire. So are there companies or resources out there that could help assist with that?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. One, yes, it could be intimidating depending on the context of the site. If it's a small patch in the middle of a crop field, then there's not particularly high stakes. But yeah, if you're adjacent to structures or something like that, it can be an intimidating proposition. One, there's what we're going to actually talk about in the next video is there's a lot of professionals out there that can help with this kind of stuff, that understand how to do, for example, prescribed fire planting and other matters, and can help you sort of anticipate some of those challenges. Another comment is that in some places around the state, we see involvement in growing involvement with rural fire departments and helping with prescribed fire. And so if you happen to live in one of those parts of the state, you might be able to get some actual professional help to come out and do some prescribed fire as well. We also have some resources on our natural resources website, which during the next video, maybe I'll grab those and throw them into the chat for how to think about designing a safe and effective prescribed fire regime for your land that includes everything from who to call in an emergency to what to think about and do about smoke and other sort of the technical aspects of the situation. So I would say in some cases, particularly in these small patches and fields, the stakes are pretty low and you don't have a lot to lose and you could safely burn. In other more technical applications, the good news is we do have these natural resource professionals like private lands wildlife biologists, NRCS professionals, Pheasants Forever biologists, and others that can maybe help you with their own expertise. So.
And so as a follow-up question to the burning aspect, if they're simply mowing and not burning, does that make them more vulnerable to unintended fires because of the extra material that's still out there? Is that an accurate assessment or not?
I guess I don't know that that's a particularly common concern in Iowa, given it's not such that, we have like a high wildfire risk in most places in Iowa. And again, where's it going to go oftentimes? So I don't know that actually would be a concern for me. The advantage to fire is that it's a natural process of controlling many different invasive species, native or exotic species. That can be an effective tool, especially with woody plants, as we mentioned. And then also many of these native prairie plants are adapted to fire. So they actually need the fire to really grow vigorously or successfully. And so that's why we really like to champion fire. And then the other thing that's nice about fire is you're not dragging problematic species along into the patch with you, because I think that's a real challenge in some of these. Is you may have a really nice stand that gets established, but if you mow a stand that has, for example, a ton of yellow sweet clover that goes into seed, and then you drive that same piece of equipment into another patch that you've established that maybe didn't have yellow sweet clover, all of a sudden you have it and you have a problematic invasive species. And fire is advantageous in that it doesn't present that additional sort of pathway for the introduction of some of these problematic species as well. So there's a lot of advantages to fire. And we actually based that recommendation off of a survey that we did that I'll talk a little bit more about, I think, after the next video. But we ask a bunch of professional wildlife biologists, those people that I'm telling you to go talk to in your own communities, these sorts of questions. What is the best approach? And it was something like 94% of them said, figure out a way to burn these things as a management strategy. So it really is basically a unanimous opinion of professional wildlife biologists and plant managers and other ecologists that are managing these ecosystems. And we just got to figure out a way to take those intimidating hurdles with prescribed fire away for people.
So the next one that came in also has a wildlife aspect. So we'll get to you, Mark, I'm sure, but this one's also for Adam. Do native perennials have any special characteristics for wildlife in terms of cover or food?
Yes. Where should I go? All of the things. That's why we get excited about native perennial vegetation for this reason. Of course, many of our wildlife species are uniquely adapted to seek out those types of plants. Now, the easiest example that I'll use is the one that everybody knows, and that's the monarch, but we don't want to take it for granted. The monarch needs native milkweed species to complete its life cycle. That can't be substituted by other things. I mean, theoretically, we could introduce exotic milkweeds, but we have like 17 to choose from. So why would we do that? And so, yes, many native plants have these uniquely evolved, or many native wildlife species have these uniquely evolved adaptations to native plants. The other thing that exotic stands tend to have that native plants, the native plant communities that we're talking about here don't have is, well, those exotic stands of vegetation in Iowa tend to be very homogeneous. So think of a smooth brome field or a reed canary grass area, or fescue or something like that, or a crop field where you have just one or maybe a few competing weedy species that are found there. And although some species of wildlife will benefit from that, the majority of wildlife that we may be thinking about trying to help in these opportunity areas in our agricultural landscapes aren't going to find what they need when there's only one species of plant, or maybe three flowering plants throughout the year or something like that. And so the more diversity we have in ecosystem in terms of plant diversity, means we're going to have more wildlife diversity. And that's going to mean we're addressing more of these challenges that we're facing in these agricultural landscapes as it relates to farmland wildlife conservation.
So Mark, the goal of this project was to target areas that were potentially flood prone or had moving water over them. What are some other siting considerations people should keep in mind when it comes to considering these projects, access to some of this maintenance, et cetera?
Yeah, so that's probably actually the biggest thing, is you do need access to it for that establishment, time frame where you want to mow off to keep those annuals back. And so, in a couple of our locations that we had this, the farmer knew that he needed access, so he kind of sacrificed two corn rows or two soybean rows, that first year to be able to do that. And so that it either takes that mentality or making sure that you have access to it. And we were focused mostly on, I'll call them the prairie potholes, the saturated flooded areas. But there's other areas on that landscape that tend to be, I'll say, prone to not being the most profitable, right? And there's different reasons for that, and there's other resource concerns other than just strictly profit, that we could be thinking about. So, maybe it's some side hills, maybe it's some of those eroded hilltops or things like that we've lost the productivity on. So we could put different areas of the field into these perennials or these natives. And again, the whole intent is to hopefully increase our overall field profitability, even though it likely means that we're going to retire some as well.
And that actually jumps into a great question here. Just asking in general, what are the cost savings of converting the land to perennials? What does it cost to establish? Will they make money on it in general?
Yeah, so the costs range. It's going to be somewhat individualized. So the seed costs, I think when we did this and got the seed a couple of years ago, we were looking at it like $100 to $125 per acre on that seed cost. But again, I know, there's different sources. And so the cost from the seed can vary a little bit, especially on mixes too. And then obviously you have your labor, your fuel and machinery as far as getting it seeded. If you have to do any type of seed bed prep to get a nice uniform seed bed, you may have some costs there. But I'm guessing that generally speaking, you're going to be able to get these perennials seeded for $250 an acre or less. To put that in comparison, the cost of production on corn and soybeans is $500 to $600 or even $700 per acre. And that varies obviously from year to year too. So your kind of your initial seeding, type cost is probably right in that, I would guess right around that $250 an acre. And then, if you think about it, that's a one-time cost, because once you get them established out there, you don't have that cost in years 2, 3, 4. You may have what I would call the mid-contract, cost of maintaining throughout there. But again, that's going to be much lower than, what you might be spending, as far as a corn or a soybean crop, as far as cost of production. And, a lot of times what we find was some of these areas, they're losing, $50 an acre or $100 an acre. And so, that establishment cost is really quite trivial when you think about, what you're losing on those year in and year out.
And then the only other thing I was going to add is that and we're going to talk about this in the next video too. In some cases, you can get a rental payment for some of these acres if you can find a program in the a practice in the conservation reserve program that you qualify for. And so the way we did it with our farmer partners in this project and at Feel was just what Mark just described. We're losing money on them anyway by trying to farm them, so we might as well convert them to something else. And something else that we chose was diverse native perennial vegetation. Those areas you're making money by not losing money and by increasing your profitability in the rest of the field. But there's also scenarios where you can actually make money by getting a rental payment for those acres by enrolling them in the conservation reserve program. And that's what we're going to talk about this. Well, one of the things we'll talk about in the next video.
Yeah, and I have a private chat that asked about removing the biomass as a feedstock, and as a substitute for that fire. And so, yeah, I think that's one way that you potentially could gain some profit or income out of, these areas on. It's just a matter of how much is it going to cost you to harvest, possibly store, transport, that type of thing versus the benefits that we get by just leaving it there too. So that is one option. The other income opportunity, and so we use, a native species, a conservation mix. But some of these areas, you might be able to find some other forage species, perennial species that you could put in there, so you could maybe get some grazing or haying out of them in certain times of the year. But again, I think those, are going to be a little bit more individualized, right? You have to have that, the need for that forage source, or you have to have the ability to sell it as well. So I think that is an option, but it's probably going to be a smaller niche idea as far as how to be able to do that.
All right. Well, I think we're at a good point to play the second half of the video. So there's another question that came in, but it might tie into the second half. So we'll go ahead and play the second half of the video, and then we'll come back for more questions, but feel free to keep typing those into the chat box and we'll come right back to them.
Also to
those areas.
Yep. So once we've established our diverse native perennials on a wet spot or unprofitable area on the farm, what sort of benefits can we expect to see? That's certainly something that, again, as a wildlife ecologist that works on the edges of our crop production practices, I get really excited about. we can find lots of different species of wildlife that take advantage of this diverse native perennial vegetation, even in really small patches like this. So we know monarch butterflies, for example, will certainly take advantage of small patches of flowering plants, and even better if we have milkweeds growing in them. And then we also find a bunch of different species of farmland birds will take advantage of areas like this. We could commonly expect to see things like eastern or western meadowlarks, dick thistles, song sparrows, common yellowthroats, and other species of birds would be pretty common to find in these areas in our farms where they wouldn't have been there when it was just a failed crop field. The other benefits is if you enjoy birds like I do and like many of our farmer partners and friends do, or if you enjoy wildflowers or just the blowing of native grasses on the breeze, the aesthetics of places like this are really quite remarkable. And we hope that that's something that people can see the value in, find value for them and their family to visit these areas throughout the year and see the different species of flowers in bloom or the different species of butterflies or birds taking advantage of them, and kind of just provide an enriching experience on the farm that's a little less tangible, but certainly something that we understand many people are motivated by.
Another environmental aspect of it is just the change in water quality. And so obviously the footprint of these, we have water quality benefits just because we're not putting in the fertilizers and the chemicals. And so we have that soil health, I'll say, benefit with the footprint, right? But then as we think about on the landscape, you know, where we're at right now, we're at the bottom of a slope. So we're on the toe slope or on the edge of the depressional area. But we have water moving down this slope, and so these areas are going to serve as kind of a filter. So we're going to reduce some of that soil nitrate that's moving through the soil here as well. And so it's going to prevent it from going right down into that creek right over there. And so that's another benefit for us when we think of this overall. And then lastly, and Adam mentioned this in our introduction a little bit, one of the reasons that this really is enticing is because it can increase our field profitability overall, right? So if these areas aren't producing and then we're not getting any revenue off of them, yet we put the cost of production into it, we're lowering our field profitability. Yes, you have some one-time costs and some establishment costs associated with these areas, but after that, you don't have the kind of the cost per acre, cost of production going into these, and therefore we're able to raise that profitability over the long term. And so there's a big benefit there as well.
So Mark, you brought up the idea of costs or the challenge of or opportunities of costs, and we should be mindful that there are expenses related to the implementation of a conservation practice like this. And so we want to sort of account for some of those. The inputs are time, equipment, and seed. And the seed costs can be pretty variable depending on what you want to plant and what's available at a given time. But we find these seed costs range from $100 to $300 an acre, with sort of a Cadillac, forb, or diversity-rich planting on the higher end of that, and more sort of homogeneous grass stand with just a few forbs on the lower end of that. The other costs, of course, would just be the equipment and time that you invest in it, particularly in those first couple of years. It's important to know that in some cases there's funding available to help implement this conservation practice on your farm. One, it may be compelling and an opportunity to enroll in a conservation reserve program practice. And we do have some conservation reserve program practices that could be tailored to fit this sort of an implementation on your farm. The prairie strips practice, CP43, also the farmable wetlands one would just be two examples, and there could be some more creative thinking as well. Other funding opportunities, maybe not necessarily a land rental rate like the Conservation Reserve Program offers, but there's lots of funding out there available to help purchase seed or defray the costs of seed. And two examples that come to mind, one is a state program called the Prairie Partners Program, where the Iowa Department of Natural Resources will help farmers cost share the cost of seed to plant native perennial vegetation on their farms. And another one that may work is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program through the NRCS that also has funding available for the establishment of diverse native perennial vegetation on farms, and this could certainly qualify for that as well.
So the key with these cost share opportunities, one, get into your district conservation office because they're going to know a lot of the government programs. And sometimes they even, like the DNR wildlife biologists, are embedded within those. And so they would also be able to help you get connected with the various opportunities for some funding.
And importantly, those people have a lot of experience in the science of establishing diverse native perennial vegetation on the farm. And as we mentioned, this is a little bit different, and many farmers are really good at producing their primary crops, but this is a different crop and this is a different paradigm, and we often have a lot of learning to do. And those professionals that you mentioned through NRCS, soil water conservation districts, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, or nonprofit groups like Pheasants Forever can be really important critical resources to help us ensure a successful experience on our farm, and maybe lead to the next one and the next one to really get this practice sort of adopted on the wide scale.
All right. So a few more questions. Mark, someone asked about any concerns with losing crop base in the FSA programs. Someone on the call here has heard that from some of the farmers.
Yeah, so yeah, putting these into a perennial, especially like a native mix, that would reduce the tillable acres, right? Because it goes out of that production mechanism. And so from that perspective, it does reduce it. The upside is that your productivity increases on the rest of the farm. So you'll see an increase on that end of that. So your tillable acres goes down, but yet your proven yield should be rising up overall, because that's based on that field average then.
Adam, this one's for you. Benefits to surrounding fields with the increase in pollinators. Someone had heard that there's maybe a benefit to soybeans because there's an increased habitat for predator species to help control aphids.
That is outside of my expertise. I am aware that some people in our entomology shop are doing that type of work, but I can't even speak competently to it. Mark, would you be able to speak competently to that?
Partly in vague terms. So yeah, I think they have found that some of the insect predators or the beneficial insects, as we call them in the crop side of things, those are a little bit more abundant because of that native mix, right? So it's helping support that, and so then you get some of those benefits on the soybean side of it as well. As far as the amount of benefit, as far as those bees and other things in those species in those areas, kind of helping with pollination on soybeans, I've heard some things along that lines as far as some additional benefits there, but I don't know the details on that.
So other ways I was thinking about, thanks for covering on that aspect. Other ways I was thinking about some spillover positive effects of rethinking some of these uses of wet areas in the field that we've heard farmers talk about. One would be that these are kind of consistent challenge areas with weeds because of the disturbance that flooding creates. And so taking them out of the production environment could potentially offer a way to sort of control those hotspots of weed pressure. The other thing that we've heard people talk about is trafficability in the field. Sometimes farmers are just waiting to go into the field in the spring for these single areas in the field to dry up. When we put diverse native perennial vegetation into these wet areas, it improves infiltration, provides some soil structure, and it might make that and then of course it takes these problematic wet areas out of the equation. You don't need to traffic through them. And theoretically you could with the improved soil structure that the vegetation provides. So it might allow you earlier access to fields as well. So, and that would of course be another advantage to the rest of the field that rethinking the uses of these wet areas provides. So there's just two other ones that come to mind. Mark, can you think of any other sort of spillover effects to the rest of the field?
Yeah, you caught the other two that I was thinking about.
And someone's curious, the impact of increased nitrate loads on native plantings. How do they handle that?
It's a good question. Well, one, I don't necessarily, like, it would be a different environment. There wouldn't be inputs necessarily going into these areas. Is that, I mean, I don't know if that's the nature of the question, but theoretically we'd be keeping the inputs out. So there shouldn't be like enrichment going on per se. But I know like COBS, the comparison of biofuel systems, has looked at impacts of fertilization on prairies, and it shifts community composition in prairie vegetation, but it isn't, necessarily, I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It certainly beats the alternatives of it just being bare soil year round because the crops always fail there. Other thoughts, Mark?
The only thing I can think of is that, if these are in the lower, wetter areas, if there is nitrate movement with water into these areas, that'd be the so to speak, the fertilization effect, more so.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. It's going to change that species composition. If I remember correctly, they do see a slight increase in the amount of biomass production as well. And I think part of it comes into play is that the grasses, they're going to benefit from that nitrogen being imported in, so to speak, where the forbs would not necessarily benefit as much.
Hey, Mark, it's Jackie.
Yep.
We just heard on Tuesday from Omar from Strips that when they do fertilize, or whichever one was speaking about cobs, when they do fertilize Matt Woods, it's a pretty significant increase in biomass. So it does, but again, why would you want to? I mean, unless you're harvesting it, you wouldn't want to. Why waste the input?
No, yeah, I would definitely agree. You don't need to fertilize these. It's just an added cost. The only thing that, like I was mentioning, is just if you have water movement, there's going to be nitrate moving with it. And so in some of these lower lying areas, that would be, a consequence potentially.
So I think these are a couple wildlife ones. We kind of addressed this one earlier about increased pollinator rates in adjacent fields. But are there any studies looking at wildlife damages in adjacent crop ground? This person noted that they work with landowners with crop damages, and a common scenario is row crop surrounded by either buffer or hay. And there are often questions of, does this increase damage to the cash crop or reduce it, or neither? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on that. The practice that we're talking about is perennial herbaceous vegetation being integrated into the crop field. And that really isn't the kind of thing that harbors common crop pests. Like the two that really come to my mind for row crop depredation in Iowa on a wide scale would be like raccoons and white-tailed deer. And I just don't think that these are really going to change the dynamics in the field for those two pests in the way that, farming adjacent to a woodland does, or shelter belts and things like that. So to me, and on the farms that I've been on, I can't really think of increased like spillover effects of wildlife depredation on adjoining acres. I'm curious, Mark, if you have any experiences with.
So the one thing we hear with row crops next to CRP fields is actually the ground squirrels and digging up seeds. And I unfortunately do not have a good solution for that. Yeah, it happens. Usually it's contained within the first couple of rows, but and the worst I've heard is out 12 rows, from those areas. But yeah, I don't have a good solution for it either. So.
Yeah, Tim, I was speaking with Tim Smith, who is part of this project this morning, and he was saying he has a healthy coyote population. So maybe it's.
That would be a good thing in this
Yes.
situation. Yeah, that's what we'd want. That and avian predators.
So a policy question. Is there any talk about using the tax system to help with converting these areas? So instead of getting an easement or rental payment, there would be a break on the property tax because you're no longer growing a cash crop.
I'm going to give that one to Adam.
Oh, dang it. I was hoping you would take it. I am firmly an ecologist, folks, and not at all skilled, and my eyes glaze over when I talk about personal finances and professional finances. So I honestly don't know about policy conversations. I think it's a wonderful question. Maybe something that we could work on getting an answer from our Center for Ag Law and Taxation or others that think on these kind of things. Even the question earlier about crop base, tillable acres, and all those kind of trade-offs are very important, tangible questions that I at least haven't personally thought about those consequences. And one of the things that we're going to do with this project between now and when we wrap the grant and later this year is to try to sort of get some of this stuff on the page. And so it's a great question, one that I don't think, given that Mark can't answer it and I know I can't answer it, we better defer on and get back to you on.
So back to establishment. So since these areas are traditionally wet, does that make it difficult for native seeds to establish, and is reseeding often necessary?
A couple of thoughts. Tempering our expectations for the most flood prone areas is probably a good way to start. The areas that we visited as part of the wildlife monitoring for this project were enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program. And almost without exception, the lowest, wettest areas in those fields were dominated by annual plant communities. That isn't necessarily a problem if in that case it doesn't violate, sort of the policy of the program. And then in other cases, as long as it doesn't create, for example, like spillover negative consequences for the adjacent field. What we find is that the establishment is much more successful in the transition areas further up out of the bottom of the wettest part of the basin. So one is sort of realistic expectations that some of these areas, it's just going to be really hard to establish native perennials down in the wettest areas. And that we see that play out in nature as well as just in these crop field settings. Second, yes, there's some unique challenges with establishing perennial vegetation in these areas that are flood prone. Among them, we just told you to plant in the way Mother Nature does, which is in the winter time. And Mother Nature also has a tendency of flooding the land in mass every spring. And that could cause problems of washing away the seed. When we did that survey with all of those professionals that are doing this stuff on the land, consistently, we heard a number of alternatives to deal with that, including, well, I'm trying to think. Yes, reseeding, replanting could occasionally be a good strategy. Trying to anticipate flooding conditions could be a strategy. The professionals talked about using lightweight equipment, just because the ground is going to be wet in many of these areas. If you're out there seeding them during, say, early spring, late winter, you might want to seed them with an ATV and not with a tractor and a drill like you would in a drier site. There are some of those site-by-site specific considerations. And then the other thing is, I've been thinking as we go, is this: have certain expectations, and don't be surprised if annual plant communities prevail in the middle and the wettest parts, and just know that that's kind of a natural process and not necessarily a problem, as long as it doesn't create problems for the adjoining field.
So a recap of our sites: when we established them, we had 4. So they were spring established. 2 of them, they got done seeded before they were in with their corn and soybean. Excuse me. One of them and then the 4th one got flooded with early spring rains, and then didn't get seeded until the June timeframe. And so I think you're right in the sense that you kind of have to be flexible and realize that, when you want to do it, it may not be possible.
So a couple questions have come in. This person's a big supporter of increasing prairie on the landscape, but with a lot of edge of field habitat for crop fields, is there a potential that things like neonics could be potential sink areas for pollinators?
I'm going to try to go again. I noticed Steve Bradbury's on the call, and he's the authority in the matter, and their work has informed this. So I trust that either Dr. Bradbury would interrupt me if I was mischaracterizing or missing something, or could maybe follow up with more resources in the chat or something too. But what we find from some work in Iowa with monarchs, Steve's work basically that I'm talking about, is that the thinking is that the risks don't outweigh the benefits of putting diverse native perennial vegetation back out into the landscape. It may be true that there's, for example, in invertebrates particularly, that there is mortality that occurs because we're putting attractive ecosystems in an area where there's a lot of pesticides applied that may threaten invertebrate life. But the thinking that Steve's group has done is that in their research has shown that the benefits outweigh the downside. And that isn't necessarily a conclusion that everybody has drawn from the work, but I think that it's a strategy that probably works for now. It seems like although some mortality may occur, it's not enough that it would essentially like depress continental populations by attracting them into these places where they may be exposed to pesticides. So I guess that's all I'd say. And then Steve, if you had anything to add to that, I'd welcome your feedback too. Perfect.
Well, that was great, Adam. Just a couple of quick points of clarification. For the neonicotinoid seed treatments, from our monitoring research at prairie strips and some other sites, the concentrations we're detecting in milkweed leaf tissue or pollen or nectar are well below the levels that would cause any adverse effects to individuals or populations or honeybee colonies, for example. Foliar applications, like Adam was saying, is a scenario where if we're putting new habitat next to the fields, the question is that going to create a population sink? So we're going to attract individuals in, they're all going to die, and that depresses the landscape population. So at least for the monarch, which is really mobile, and the honeybees, which are sort of mobile between beekeepers moving them around and what they do on their own, what we're finding out from our toxicology studies, all our modeling, is that no, they don't end up being population sinks. And in fact, we're going to get more monarch production, for example, in the landscape by putting habitat anywhere we can, even though some years, some places, there may be a suppression of production based on how the wind's blowing at the time of application. Having said that, following IPM is really important. We don't need to spray for soybean aphids unless we're exceeding economic thresholds. And it's really important to follow the spray drift guidelines on the label.
Thanks so much,
Perfect.
Dr. Bradbury.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
So kind of on that vein, but more on the plant side, is there any concern for these perennial vegetations to creep into the row crop areas?
I was going to give that one to you, Mark. The row crops are yours.
Yeah, so this comes back to maybe some of the strips work that's done. And so what they do find is that generally speaking, where we have the row crop, there's a nice divide there. So they aren't necessarily creeping in and invading into that row crop area. And largely that's because of the herbicides that we're using in those row crop areas just preclude them from being able to move in. If anything, I think my concern would be is that we might get too aggressive with our herbicides and start to encroach upon the areas that we were seeding.
So what advice do you have for folks that maybe do have custom application for their chemicals, and how they can best maybe communicate that with their applicators to avoid those issues?
Yeah, so in the establishment years, it's really, having some good markers out there, some flags out there, so that you delineate the areas that are supposed to be, in a perennial or have those species out there, right? And then in subsequent years, a lot of the technology that we're using, especially on the custom applicators, is they set up field boundaries, and so the field boundary, just works its way around that, and then the technology in the sprayers is such that we have auto shutoffs. And so that's a very easy, effective way of making sure that we're not spraying into those areas. And so really what it comes down to is communicating well, and then making sure that whoever's doing that custom application, knows what they're doing and knows what you're trying to do.
Great. Well, it looks like we have maybe time for a couple more questions if folks want to get those typed in. But in the meantime, I'm going to share my screen just one more time. is if you joined us today for CCA credits, and I'll put this in the chat as well, you can email me your name, your CCA number to my email there by 5 p.m. today to make sure that I get your credits submitted. If perchance you have an area that you think would work well for a wetland or oxbow in addition to perennial vegetation, please also email me that same email address, and I can help connect you with folks at the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship to help see if your spot could work for one of those practices. And lastly, we're going to kind of keep on this perennial vegetation concept with our next virtual field day, which is just a little bit later this month on February 24th, again at 1 p.m. Central. We're going to be talking to 5 of our farmer partners who have utilized perennial vegetation on their landscape as part of our Sea Change project hosted here at Iowa State. So it's going to be a great conversation as well, and I hope you can join us then. So I'll stop sharing again and take a look, see. Does not look like I have had any more questions in here, but if Mark or Adam, you have any final parting thoughts you want to share us, we'll wrap things up.
Okay, I could go first with some final thoughts. Things to reiterate. Growing perennial plant communities, particularly diverse and native perennial plant communities, is a pretty different paradigm than what we're accustomed to on our row crop acres. And so I hope that folks maybe think about that as an exciting learning opportunity, developing these new skills, and start to talk to people that have had success with it. And then I'll just reiterate one more time that we're lucky in the state to have a strong network of natural resource professionals around the state that do have experiences and can translate some of the experiences that other farmers have had to make your journey in establishing diverse native perennial vegetation on your farm a little bit easier. So you could use that link that I sent out in the chat earlier with contacts to find county specific wildlife biologists, or pick up the phone and call your county conservation board, because many of those folks also have roadside vegetation crews and others that are doing prairie work and have been for many years in many cases, and have a lot of knowledge about how we can do this and do it effectively. And I think if you have early success and you get that help, then you're really not going to regret reimagining the boundaries of your field edges.
The only thing I would add to that is really take the time and look at your yield maps and think about the profitability mapping. And there's, retailers, there's service providers that can help you do that. And look at that over a longer time period, 5 years, 10 years, and really sit back and say, where are these areas at? Because I think there are opportunity areas that we're not necessarily making, a lot of money on. And so why don't we try to get some of those soil health, water quality, wildlife benefits out of them?
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much, and thank you everyone for attending today. Please check your email boxes this afternoon for a quick evaluation, and we appreciate that you send that back to us. All right, everyone, have a warm February afternoon.